Back when I was an undergrad, I had a couple of buddies who were big stargazers and really into astronomy. One of them lived in a remote part of eastern Washington where you could see everything clearly away from any light pollution. He invited another friend and I to visit his family for Thanksgiving one year. We said yes and tagged along for the holiday, all of us really excited to get away for a few days. One of the nights we were there, we all drove out to a field of knee-high grass to look up at the sky and check out the stars with my buddy's telescope. It was a really cool experience, and we actually saw a bunch of shooting stars during the first hour or so. My friend suddenly pointed to a bright light in the sky and asked what it was. My other friend, the one who was into astronomy, said he didn't know what it was. It looked kind of like a planet, but apparently there shouldn't have been any visible planets that night. I don't know enough about stars to know if that's true or not, but that's what he said, and he was positive it wasn't a planet. To me, it looked like it was way too close to be something in space. I thought it looked more like the altitude that a small plane would fly at. We all started to notice that it was moving a little bit. Actually, I don't want to say that it moved, but it looked like it was bobbing in the sky, or kind of bouncing up and down slightly. Then, like a candle, it just fizzled out. It literally looked like it burned up in the sky. That would have been weird by itself, but that wasn't the weirdest part. We really didn't spend too much time talking about it other than joking that we'd all seen a UFO, but then we came across this random guy right in the middle of the field. I still have no idea how he got there since we could see pretty far in all directions, and we absolutely would have noticed a car pulling in near ours. He looked young and probably around our age. He wasn't wearing any shoes or a shirt, and as far as I could tell, the only thing he had on was a pair of jeans. He was sitting curled up with his arms wrapped around his knees and shivering. Keep in mind, this was the end of November and on the Thanksgiving weekend, so no one should have been out there without a coat, much less a shirt. We were scared to approach him at first, so we asked from where we were standing if he was okay. He sort of stared at us blankly and said he was fine. He didn't sound drunk or like he was on drugs, but you could hear in his voice that he was really cold. Eventually, we walked over to him and asked how he got there. He told us that he couldn't remember how he'd gotten there and didn't know what was going on. Then he must have changed his mind about being okay and told us that he needed to go to the hospital. This freaked everybody out a little because we had no idea what happened to this guy or what kind of injuries we might have to help him with if he was hurt. My friend immediately called 911 to let them know our situation and what was going on, and probably only 15 minutes later, 2 cops showed up with an ambulance at the area where we parked. I let the guy borrow my coat and we helped him walk to the ambulance to get checked out. He didn't really say anything to us other than asking what our names were and what we were doing out there. When we told him we were there to look at stars, he asked us about a couple of constellations, which seemed a little strange, but I thought he might be in shock or just trying to think of other things instead of whatever was wrong with him. Once we got to the ambulance, the paramedics took him and the cops pulled us aside and asked us to hang around for a little bit to answer a few questions. While we were talking to the cops, we saw the paramedics help the guy into the back of the ambulance, then they closed the doors and took the guy away. I forgot to even get my jacket back from him before they left. After telling the cops the entire story and that we had no idea who this guy was, they took our contact info and let us leave. When we got back to my friend's house, we stayed up talking about it for a while, wondering if we'd get a call from the police with more details, but we never heard anything. My friend told the story to his family the next morning when we were all in the living room having coffee, and hearing it out loud made me realize that I'd forgotten all about the weird bobbing light we'd seen in the sky right before we found that guy. He made that connection, and after he said it, I definitely thought it was strange too. His family thought the whole thing was creepy, but figured we'd just had a run-in with a drug addict or some college kid that had taken a hallucinogen and wandered off alone. The more I thought about it though, the more I started to believe the light had something to do with it. It was like that guy had just been dropped there in the field. There's no way he walked all the way out there alone, wearing nothing but a pair of jeans when the temperature was in the 30s. After that, we all kind of put the whole experience on the back burner because of the holiday, and the rest of the weekend with his family ended up being really nice, and it was a great Thanksgiving. It was brought up a few more times, but that was about it. There was some talk of calling the police back to see if we could get any more information about what happened to the guy, but no one ever did it. I still think about that night, and I'll always wonder what happened to him because it was such a weird experience. I just have this gut feeling he was taken by someone or something, then dropped there alone right in the field. The fact that he had no memory of what happened or why he was there really deeply bothers me. This is a family story that I've heard only twice, and even then, it was shared sparingly. The first time it came up was in passing during a family conversation. I can't recall what prompted it. Maybe we were talking about strange experiences or unusual memories, but the explanation was vague and almost hesitant. It intrigued me enough to bring it up again months later during one of our annual family gatherings. This would have been in late August because that's when our family traditionally comes together. We were sitting outside after dinner, enjoying the cool evening air, and I brought up the story cautiously, not wanting to sound overly curious. It was clear that some of my family was uncomfortable talking about it, but this time they did give me more details. The incident happened sometime in the 1990s. The exact year wasn't clear, but it would have been in the earlier part of the decade, perhaps 1992 or 93. At that time, my grandmother's brother, along with some other family members, had taken a trip from Ukraine, where they live, to Turkey. They had rented a small cottage in a remote part of the Turkish countryside for a few weeks. The cottage was somewhere in the southern regions close to the coast, and they described it as beautiful and isolated. The cottage itself had a small kitchen, a sitting room, and a couple of bedrooms. Outside, there was a fenced yard where another one of my grandmother's brothers kept his 2 dogs during their stay. Beyond the fence were rolling hills, sparse trees, and open land. They were far enough from any village that they rarely saw other people except when they went into town. Their experience happened late one evening during their stay, but my family didn't remember the exact time. All they said was that it was a quiet night and everyone was inside relaxing after dinner. The dogs, which had been calm and quiet all day, suddenly started barking. And not just barking, going absolutely crazy to the point that they weren't even listening to come inside. My grandmother's brother went outside to see what was making his dogs freak out. He expected to find a stray animal or perhaps even some kind of wild predator near the fence. What he saw instead made him call for everyone else to come outside. He pointed to the sky where an object was approaching. It was high up at first, but it was unmistakably coming straight down and moving closer to the cottage. He described it as a dark, triangle-shaped object with 3 lights, one in each corner. The lights weren't blinking or flickering like you'd see on an airplane. They were steady and bright, casting an unnatural glow on the underside of it. The object didn't make any noise, which made its movement even more unsettling. As it came closer, it began to slow down, but was still hovering directly above the cottage. The rest of the family came out to see what was happening, and as soon as they saw it, they were terrified. Everyone stood there frozen, watching this thing come down. My grandmother's brother said it felt like time had slowed down, as if the moment stretched longer than it should have. They all agreed on the details. A dark triangular shape with 3 lights and no sound that anyone could hear. When the object got closer to the house, panic set in. The dogs were louder than ever, but their barking slowly started to be overpowered by a low, vibrating hum that filled the air. They said the hum was something you could feel more than you could hear. I guess the doors and windows of the cottage began to shake, and they heard dishes and cups falling to the floor and shattering. The vibration wasn't violent, but it was intense enough to make you feel it deep into the ground. At this point, most of my family ran back inside because they were scared to be out in the open. They huddled together, unsure of what to do. The object hovered over the cottage for several minutes, and the few family members that stayed outside said it didn't spin or rotate or do anything. It just hovered there, perfectly still. And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it began to ascend back up into the sky. The vibration and hum slowly tapered off as it got higher in the air, but it didn't take off at some incredible speed. It simply moved upward, getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. The dogs eventually calmed down and the vibrations completely stopped. The house was quiet again, but the family was too shaken to sleep. They stayed up for hours talking about what they'd seen, trying to make sense of it. My family is full of rational, conservative people. They aren't the type to entertain wild stories or talk about the supernatural. They hate gossip and very quickly dismiss anything that can't be explained logically. That's what makes this story so compelling to me. They all confirmed what they had seen, at least the ones who were still alive when I asked about it. They didn't embellish or try to draw attention to it. In fact, they seemed reluctant to talk about it at all. I've thought about this story many times over the years. I've tried to imagine what it must have been like to stand there in the darkness, watching something so completely unexplainable. It's easy to dismiss stories like these as exaggerations or misinterpretations, but knowing my family, I can't. They aren't the type to lie or seek attention. Whatever they saw that night was real, and I have no reason to doubt their account. I call my experience a flubduction because I believe I was able to prevent whatever was going to happen from happening. Thus, the beings I'm going to tell you about flubbed my abduction. This is my true experience, but I'm going to use different names for my now ex-husband and my son. In the spring of 1981, I was married to Paul, and our infant son Gabriel was about 4 months old. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor in a suburb of Chicago. We had recently transitioned Gabriel to his own bedroom and crib from a cradle that was still in the master bedroom where Paul and I slept. That night, Paul was asleep beside me when I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, aware that I was somehow being lifted, or more accurately, levitated above my bed. I could feel my body slowly rising up, but after just a few seconds I felt it stop when I was about 2 feet above the bed. I also somehow knew that some kind of entity was in the room and had purposely raised my body toward the ceiling. I sensed their presence at first, then turned my head and saw 4 short, gray-colored beings with large dark eyes next to my side of the bed. I don't know why, but I got the impression they were male beings. I also can't explain this, but I knew I was in their hands and that they had raised me above the bed, but without physically touching me. It was like the knowledge of that fact was given to me. I just don't know how to describe it. I also remember being scared when I saw them there, but not terrified. You would think the sight of seeing beings like this would send anyone into an instant panic, but what I felt was more of a general anxiety about what might happen to me. After my body had stopped, there was an extremely intense and bright light shining through my bedroom window. I knew there was a lamppost in the parking lot below our bedroom window, and weirdly, my first thought was that I had neglected to pull the shade down and close the bedroom curtains before going to sleep, but I slowly realized that there was no way that lamp could be even close to as bright as this light was. I was quite awake now and realizing the gravity of my situation. I was floating above my bed, but I couldn't move the majority of my body. It was as if I were partially paralyzed. I could still turn my head, look around, and clearly make out the details of my bedroom. I could even hear Paul snoring quietly on the bed below me. I started to panic about not being able to move my arms or legs and tried to yell to Paul to wake him up, but I couldn't make a sound. It felt like my throat completely quit working. I suddenly thought about my son and immediately felt concerned for his safety, but thankfully I could still turn my head and see into his bedroom from my position, and it looked like he was fine. All I could do was hope that whatever was going on would stay in our room. I remember looking over and seeing the red LED numbers on my alarm clock, and it said 3:47 a.m. I could see the texture and detail of the paint on the wall beside my head, and even the wood grain on our closet doors. Those images became my anchor to reality. I knew I was wide awake because I could see those details so clearly. It couldn't possibly be a dream because these were real, sharp, accurate details which you would never have in a dream. Out of nowhere, I began to get this mental message, for lack of a better term, that I was going to be moved toward the bright light at my window, which was starting to glow even brighter. I mentally refused to go there and started to shake my head violently. I started seeing visions of myself going into the light and out the window, then falling down onto the parking lot 2 floors below. This mental message came again that I must go toward the light, this time even stronger like a command, but I refused again. I repeatedly thought, I am not going there, I am not going there. I was doing everything in my power physically and mentally to wiggle myself out of this paralysis, but nothing seemed to be working. After a few minutes of horribly struggling like this, I got an overwhelming feeling through my body and mind that I had won the argument. I did not go toward the window, and I remember snapping out of the paralysis and opening my eyes in my bed just a moment later. I literally jumped out of our bed and walked to the window to close it, but the shade was already pulled down and the drapes were closed. My son and husband were still both soundly asleep like nothing had happened at all. My heart was still beating out of my chest, and I was so sweaty that I decided to just get up for the day and take a shower. Once I got into the shower, I was able to collect myself a bit and almost wash off some of the horrific experience. I felt a little better when I got out, and I was really happy to see the sun starting to rise. When Paul got up, I told him what had happened and poured out every last detail. He was sure it had just been a really bad nightmare and kept telling me to relax and to try to forget about it. His reaction really upset me, and I didn't like that he wanted to dismiss the whole thing as some kind of dream. I knew this wasn't a dream. As I thought about what had happened over the next few days, I started to feel frustrated. I couldn't for the life of me figure out what had actually happened. I had heard of sleep paralysis and out-of-body experiences, but this was different. This felt like I was actually being taken away from my room, like a literal abduction. It was a very real experience, especially my awareness of the physical surroundings of my room while it was happening. I was absolutely certain of one thing. I had been awake and was not sleeping. I haven't had any repressed memories or feelings pop up of possibly being taken and not remembering, and I don't wish to dredge any up. I'm not sure why I was being coaxed to go toward the light, or why I thought I had the right to refuse to do so. If these beings had me under their control, they could have simply done whatever they wanted with me. Over time, I've become comfortable with the explanation that I was almost abducted, and I'd really like to just leave it at that.